Hashtag $1 bought me 1,000 pounds of flour. My supermarket system turned me into the richest man in a famine-stricken kingdom. Marcus Osei was not a hero. He was not a visionary. He was not the kind of man who walked into rooms and made people stop talking. He was the kind of man who noticed things. Not important things. Not the things people wrote books about. He noticed the small, quiet things that everyone else walked past without blinking. A misplaced price tag. A shelf restocked in the wrong order. A clearance sticker that had no business being where it was. For 11 years, Marcus worked as an inventory manager for a grocery chain. Not a famous one. Not a large one. Just a mid-sized chain with 11 stores and a head office that smelled like old carpet and printer ink. His job was to know where everything was, how much it cost, and how much of it existed at any given moment. He was very good at his job. He was not rewarded particularly well for being good at it, but that was fine. Marcus did not work for rewards. He worked because systems made sense to him in a way that people often did not. He lived alone in a duplex apartment on the quieter side of the city. His neighbors were a retired schoolteacher named Dolores, a young couple who argued through the wall at regular intervals, and a man named Phil who kept extremely unusual hours and never made eye contact. Marcus got along with all of them by staying largely invisible. His apartment was clean. Organized. His pantry looked like something a documentary crew might film without asking permission. Canned goods faced outward in perfect rows. Dry goods were stored in sealed containers labeled in his own handwriting. He rotated stock the way the grocery chain had trained him to, oldest items at the front, newest at the back. First in, first out. His friends, on the rare occasions they visited, said it looked obsessive. Marcus said it looked sensible. He was right. But he did not know yet how right. The app was called Clearance Alert. It had been downloaded by approximately 4,000 people at its peak popularity, which had passed 2 years earlier. By the time of this story, Marcus was one of perhaps 200 people who still had notifications turned on. The app scraped pricing data from participating retailers and flagged items that had dropped below a certain cost threshold. It was designed for people who coupon clipped seriously and bought protein powder in bulk. Marcus used it because he had once saved 60% on canned tomatoes and never fully recovered from the joy of that. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, his phone buzzed. He was eating oatmeal. He looked at the notification without expecting anything interesting. The notification was interesting. MartPlus, a large grocery store 12 minutes from his apartment, had flagged a bulk clearance item under a category called Baking Essentials, Overstock Reduction, All-Purpose Flour. 1,000 pounds. The price listed was $0.00. The app noted that the checkout system would round this to the nearest cent and charge a minimum transaction fee. $1. Marcus read this 3 times. Then he put down his oatmeal, picked up his keys, and drove to MartPlus. The flour was there. It was stacked on a pallet in the back corner of the baking aisle, still wrapped in its original warehouse plastic. 50-pound sacks, 20 of them, tagged with a bright orange clearance sticker that said was $847, now $0.00. Someone in the pricing department had entered a number wrong. Or entered nothing at all. The system had done the rest. A MartPlus employee was walking toward the pallet with a pricing gun when Marcus arrived. He got there first. He picked up one sack, carried it to the nearest employee, and asked if the clearance tag was correct. The employee checked his device. He looked at the pallet. He looked at Marcus. He said he would need to ask a manager. Marcus waited. He was good at waiting. It was 90% of inventory management. The manager came. The manager looked at the tag. The manager looked at his own screen. The manager made a face like a man who had found a spider in his coffee. He confirmed that the pricing was a system error and would normally be corrected before the item reached the floor. However, he also confirmed that the store policy on clearance items was that a tagged price was a valid price if a customer was already at the register. Marcus asked if he could buy all 20 sacks. The manager said there was no policy against that. Marcus asked if he could rent a store cart and bring his car around to the loading area. The manager said yes. At the register, the system charged him $1. The cashier looked at the receipt the way people look at something they will think about for a long time. Marcus took the receipt, folded it carefully, and put it in his wallet. He drove to a rental van company. He spent $40. He drove back to Mart Plus. He loaded 20 50-pound sacks of flour into the van with help from a very confused stock boy whom he tipped $5. He drove home. He carried the sacks into his apartment 2 at a time. It took an hour. He stacked them in his spare room with the precision of a man who had spent 11 years thinking about how things fit into spaces. Then he sat down, ate the rest of his oatmeal cold, and did not think much about any of it. 3 days later, the grain ports closed. It did not happen the way people expect things like that to happen. There was no explosion. No single dramatic announcement. No news anchor with a grim face saying everything had changed. There was a blight. A fast-moving fungal infection that had been spreading through wheat crops in the northern growing regions for months, documented in agricultural reports that nobody outside the industry had read. It moved through fields quietly. It moved through supply chains even more quietly. And then one week, the shipments that were supposed to arrive at the regional distribution center did not arrive. And the week after that, the backup shipments did not arrive either. Store shelves held on for about 2 weeks. People did not panic immediately. They bought a little more than usual. They cleared the pasta. They bought rice. They looked at the flour section and thought about it and then moved on, because there was still flour on the shelves, and surely this was temporary. It was not temporary. By the end of the first month, flour had disappeared from every store in the city. Not because it had all been bought at once, but because the supply that normally refreshed the shelves every few days simply stopped coming. The distribution networks rerouted available grain supplies to the largest cities first. The city where Marcus lived was not one of the largest. It was the kind of city that always got the second wave of everything, the second wave of investment, the second wave of infrastructure, the second wave of aid. The second wave did not come quickly. Marcus watched all of this from his apartment, surrounded by 1,000 pounds of flour in neat stacks, and felt something he could only describe as a very uncomfortable kind of calm. Dolores knocked on his door on a Thursday evening. She was 71 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the other half of the duplex for 20 years. She brought Marcus food occasionally, jollof rice at Christmas, plantain on random Saturdays as if plantain required a special occasion, which Marcus had come to believe it did. She called him by his last name when she wanted something and by his first name when she was worried. She called him Marcus. She asked if he had any flour. Her voice was measured and careful in the way voices get when they are holding something back. She had baked bread every Sunday for 40 years. She did not say this. She did not need to. Marcus told her yes. He gave her 10 pounds. She looked at the bag and then at him and then at the spare room behind him, where 20 sacks were visible through the open door. She said, "Marcus, that is a lot of flour." He agreed that it was. She left. He closed the door. He stood in his kitchen for a long time looking at the spare room. He had given 10 pounds away for free. It was the right thing to do. Dolores was 71 and she baked bread on Sundays and she had brought him jollof rice at Christmas. Free was correct. But he also had 1,000 pounds of something that the entire city needed, and no particular plan, and a brain that could not stop running numbers. He sat down at his kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. He started writing. He did not set prices based on what people would pay in desperation. He understood that a man who was hungry would pay almost anything, and he also understood that charging a hungry man everything he had was not a pricing strategy. It was something else entirely, and Marcus did not want to be that. He built a system instead. 3 tiers. Not formal. Not announced. Assessed through conversation and observation, adjusted quietly. A woman who mentioned her children in the first 2 minutes of talking to him paid one rate. A man who arrived in a clean car and a pressed shirt paid a higher one. A local restaurant owner who was trying to keep her doors open and her staff employed paid in kind, 1 meal delivered to Marcus per week, 2 hours of her nephew's labor on Saturdays, and information. The information was the most valuable part. Through the restaurant owner, whose name was Priya, Marcus learned which small warehouse on the east side of the city was holding forgotten stock from a distributor that had gone quiet. Through Priya's supplier contact, he found 700 pounds of rice and 400 pounds of dried lentils that had been sitting in a temperature-controlled unit nobody was currently billing. He negotiated access through a combination of persistence, a written inventory proposal, and the promise of a fair payment structure once he had the cash flow to support it. The warehouse manager shook his hand and said he had never met a grocery employee who talked like a lawyer. Marcus said he had simply read a lot of policies. He was not bragging. He had genuinely read a lot of policies. Word traveled through the neighborhood the way urgent things always travel, not through any announcement, but through the quiet sidewalk grammar of neighbors talking to neighbors. He has flour. He is fair. He does not gouge. He is not free, but he is fair. People came to his door with things to trade. Preserved food. Skills. Time. A retired mechanic offered to fix Marcus's van in exchange for a 30-pound flour allocation per month. A woman who had been a nurse brought medical supplies and her own knowledge, and they worked out a trade that took 40 minutes to negotiate and left both of them satisfied. A young man named Deo, who was 22 and had nowhere to be and nothing particular to do, showed up one morning and asked if there was work. Marcus put him to work immediately, organizing the storage room that had by then expanded from the spare bedroom into the garage, the hallway closet, and a rented storage unit 2 blocks away. Within 6 weeks, Marcus was not alone. He had 7 people working with him, each paid in a combination of food security and small amounts of cash when cash was available. He had moved his operation from his apartment into a commercial space, a former bakery supply shop whose owner had left the city in the second week of the shortage and was willing to negotiate a rental agreement via phone calls from several hundred miles away. The agreement was 2 months free, then a monthly rate paid partly in flour allocation for the owner's elderly mother who had stayed behind. Marcus wrote all of this in his notebook. Every arrangement. Every trade. Every name and what they had given and what they were owed. His handwriting was very small and very neat. The newspaper found him in the 8th week. It was a small paper, one of 2 that still printed physical copies. A reporter named Sandra came to the commercial space on a Wednesday afternoon and stood at the doorway watching Marcus direct Deo and 2 other workers in reorganizing a delivery before she introduced herself. She asked if she could write about what he was doing. Marcus said she could write about whatever she liked. He asked her if she wanted to understand the supply chain mechanics or just the human interest angle. She laughed. She said both. The article ran on page 4 of that Friday's edition under a headline that called Marcus an unlikely anchor of food security. He read it standing in his kitchen. He did not feel like what the article described. He felt like a man who had spent 6 weeks running numbers and making phone calls and lifting heavy things and not sleeping well. He felt tired in the specific, textured way of a person who has been responsible for something large and unplanned. He cut the article out and taped it above his light switch. He was not sure why. The government official arrived on a Monday with 2 colleagues and the particular energy of people who have realized something significant has happened without their involvement. His name was Commissioner Harley. He was polite. He was also clearly uncomfortable, which Marcus understood. Nobody enjoys discovering that a problem they were supposed to solve has been partially solved by a man with a notebook and a clearance app. Commissioner Harley said he wanted to discuss integrating Marcus's operation into the official aid distribution framework. He said this with a tone that suggested integration meant supervision, and supervision meant control, and control meant that the commissioner's office would be able to say they had managed the situation effectively. Marcus listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he said he was happy to report to the framework. He would share his inventory records, his pricing data, and his distribution logs. He would work within any reasonable oversight structure. He would not, however, cede pricing authority, because his pricing model was the reason the system was working, and standardizing it to a flat rate would immediately remove the equity component that made it functional rather than just large. He said this calmly. He cited 2 regional emergency ordinances and 1 federal food security guideline that technically supported his position. He watched the commissioner's face do something complicated. The officials left without resolving anything. They came back 6 weeks later with a formal partnership agreement that was, in its structure, almost exactly what Marcus had described the first time. He read it carefully. He made 3 edits in the margins. He signed it. The grain ports reopened on a Wednesday, 4 months and 11 days after they had closed. The news came through a regional alert on Marcus's phone while he was counting the remaining inventory in the storage room. He read the notification. He put his phone in his pocket. He kept counting. There was not a moment of dramatic relief. There was not a scene where he looked out a window at the sky and felt the weight lift. He had been managing a shortage for 17 weeks. The work did not stop because the shortage was ending. There were still people relying on the distribution schedule. There were still trades to honor and records to close out and 7 workers who needed to know what came next. He finished counting. He walked out to where Deo was working and told him the ports had reopened. Deo stopped what he was doing and sat down on a crate and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So what happens to us?" Marcus told him the municipal framework had agreed to absorb the distribution operation as a permanent community food access program. The 7 workers had been offered positions within it. The commercial space would continue as a community exchange, expanding beyond flour to other goods as normal supply chains rebuilt themselves. Deo nodded. He looked at the stacks of remaining sacks. He asked how much flour was left. Marcus checked his notebook. 47 pounds. He brought it to Dolores on a Saturday morning. All of it, in the original sacks, stacked carefully in his van and carried up her front steps 2 at a time the same way he had carried them down from his own apartment 17 weeks earlier. Dolores looked at the sacks. She looked at him. She said she did not need 47 pounds of flour. He said he knew. But it was hers. She had been the first person who made him understand that the flour was not just flour. It was Sundays. It was 40 years of something ordinary being possible. He had spent 17 weeks trying to make ordinary things possible for a city, and it had started with her voice being careful on his doorstep. She made him come inside. She baked bread that afternoon. It took 3 hours. He sat at her kitchen table drinking tea and answering her questions about whether he was sleeping, which he mostly was, and whether he was eating properly, which he mostly was not. She put half the bread on a plate and set it in front of him. He ate it. It was the first thing he had eaten that entire week that he had not calculated, traded for, or written down in a notebook. It was just bread. Plain, warm, unremarkable bread. It was the best thing he had eaten in 4 months. He drove home after dark. He sat in his kitchen, which still had the shape of a room that had held 1,000 pounds of flour, the slight marks on the floor, the chalk lines on the wall he had used to track stacks, the smell of dry grain that had settled into the walls so deeply that it would probably still be there in 5 years. The sticky note above the light switch said $1.00 in his small, neat handwriting. He looked at it for a while. He did not take it down. He was not the kind of man who made speeches about what things meant. He was the kind of man who noticed things, and who paid attention when other people looked away, and who understood, in a very practical and unromantic way, that $1 spent on the right thing at the right moment can become the most important dollar in the world. Not because of luck. Not because of brilliance. Because he had been paying attention for 11 years, and the world had finally made it matter. He turned off the light. He went to sleep. In the morning, there would be more work. There was always more work. And he was, as he had always been, very good at it.